Are you a leader, manager, entrepreneur, business owner, or knowledge worker? Are you leading people or wondering how to be a better leader in your own life and work? If you are, then you can be experimenting better. Welcome to The Experimental Leader, a podcast that takes a look at the ways leaders are experimenting in their own work. Hosted by Melanie Parish, we dive into real-life conversations about how people might be using a scientist's mindset and experimenting in their work. Shift your leadership into something that works better. Join us on The Experimental Leader today.
Hello, I'm Melanie Parish. It's great to be with you here today. And I've been thinking about changing things in my business. As I think about my leadership today, I've been thinking about how do we change something, and sort of the longer we're in business, the more stable things start to feel, and we sort of have ways we do things. And then when we think of changing them, we have to consider, like, what are the implications of that? And so I was just sort of thinking about that. And so we spent some time as a team today kind of talking about our current reality. What are we currently doing? What do we like about what we're currently doing? What do we want to change about what we're currently doing? We're looking around our brand and our messaging and things like that. And I just think it's interesting to think about. So we looked for both things we really like and things that we think we have opportunity to do better. And then what we want our values to be that we stand on as we make a change. And I think it's an interesting way to think about it. I think we as leaders, we often think, oh, well, we can just change that. And sometimes that's true. But as the bigger the change, I think the more people I want to involve in asking questions and thinking about how we change and what will that impact. And so it's an interesting process to think about how we change. So I just want to ask you, I want to give you a challenge to look at things that you might want to change around the way you work, around the way you lead, around your organization, and then to give you a challenge to figure out what the process is you want to go through as you think about change. Because I think it's also interesting to choose your own process, create your own reality before you just start changing things. Only in like solopreneurships that are super simple can you just change things without any conversation, which is, wow, how cool is that when you can do that? But as businesses become more mature, they have all these sort of internal structures, and then it's really interesting to think about how we might change them. And I am very excited about our guest today. Our guest is Angela Johnson, and Angela is located in Minnesota and is enjoying working globally. And Angela is an educator, a speaker, an author, and a leader in the agile space, is a certified Scrum trainer and certified LeSS practitioner, and the author of the Scrum Master Files, Secrets Every Coach Should Know. Welcome to the show, Angela.
Thank you so much for having me, Melanie.
Well, it's super fun to be here with you today. And I usually just dive into our book club segment because I know that you did a little reading on chapter 6, Testing Bottlenecks. And I'd love to hear just kind of what your thoughts were, if you relate it to your work, or what, how did this land with you?
I did write down a very specific thought there about, that single biggest bottleneck being management attention. And as a small business owner, that really resonates with me. One of the things I don't want is to be that bottleneck. If you can imagine my team members having to say to a customer, or even having to say to each other, well, we have to wait for Angela. Well, let's see what Angela says, or let's see what Angela decides. No, I don't want to be that bottleneck. So I really want to make sure that we test for those, and then that we're a little proactive in ensuring that we don't have them in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a really good point. And I know that I see my clients struggle with this. Like, we've done Kanban boards with clients, and I actually put a column when it's a business that's emerging out of a solopreneurship, and there's sort of one decision maker, waiting for decisions so that there's a place that they can go to in their Kanban board, because that limits work in progress. And I work really hard not to be the bottleneck in my company too. It's like, oh, let me see how I can get out of the way. And one of my favorite ways to get out of the way on this is to make somebody else the leader on everything we do, so that they have full permission to bug me, to put themselves in my calendar, to remove the bottleneck, so that I don't become the keeper of the bottleneck. They become the keeper of the bottleneck, so they can push me. I don't know what you do in your organization. I'm sure you have strategies too for how do you get out of your own way?
Yeah, we use a board as well. And we've named that column blocked, just so that there's visibility, blocked or blockers, to make sure that
nice.
There's visibility to it.
Yeah.
Another thing that we do, because a number of people on the team coach and train, we kind of try to drink our own champagne, so as we hear somebody, and this just happened today in the office, one of my teammates was talking about not knowing how to do something. And I said, yet. And he went, thank you. Because it's like, I don't know how to do it yet. What would it take you to know how to do it? Do you need help from one of us, or do you just want to try something? Because your book also talks about experiments. So it's like, do you want to run an experiment, or do you want somebody to show you? And then now you can carry the torch from there, so that we don't have a single point of failure or some kind of bottleneck.
I love that. And I love, especially thinking about bottlenecks, there's so many things in business that we don't know. And you get to choose. I like this dichotomy that you're either choosing to experiment or you're choosing to go find a best practice, is kind of what, like, you can sometimes do either. Like, the best practice is only the current best practice. There may be a future best practice that you might find by experimenting. And there's value to both. You don't want to be reinventing the wheel all the time in your business or organization, because it's heavy. You get tired. I'm sure you've worked in startups, and I have. I've worked in lots of startups, and it's like, oh, so-and-so wore this clothing to work today. Now we have to create a whole, policy manual on dress code, or, whatever it is. It's like one-offs all become something that you have to create a whole thing from.
Totally true.
Just respond in the moment.
Yeah. And you mentioned dress code, and maybe in this day and age of us being online like this, we can get away with more than we used to get away with. But I remember we had a new team member, and we were meeting at a client site, and it was downtown, in this tall professional office building. And bless her heart, she showed up in yoga pants and a t-shirt. And I was, in professional dress. And as we're meeting each other by the elevator, she just took one look at me and went, and I, of course, was looking at her going, she said, I didn't know we had to dress up. You didn't tell me we had to dress up. And I'm like, I didn't know I needed to tell you
to dress for work. Yeah.
So all these assumptions, I think, is kind of at the heart of what you're talking about. It's like, if we didn't test for those assumptions early, then they kind of bite us later, when they rear their head.
Well, I'm curious, did you do anything to solve it, or just went in with the yoga pants?
We went with it.
Yeah.
And we made it a learning opportunity for the client, because we were there to talk to the client, their leadership team, about different ways of working with their team. So we just made it a point of education.
You just said, there's different dress styles, and that's interesting.
But also, as leaders, if they don't set the expectation, don't assume people are going to know.
How would they know?
Right.
How would you know? I mean,
unless as leaders, we are transparent about it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. The other thing that I noticed about that is that the dress code was not the bottleneck, probably, for doing work with the client that day.
It wasn't.
It worked okay. It was like, it would have been nice to look, the right way, but it didn't get in the way. It didn't stop the flow.
Right.
I was going to read a little passage, and then barriers are different from bottlenecks.
Yeah.
And this is from the experimental leader. Sometimes leaders experience not a bottleneck, but a barrier, something external beyond your control, or something that happens in the economy that no amount of experimenting will improve. Some barriers resolve quickly, some take more time. Sometimes you can see them coming from far off, sometimes they come out of nowhere. The 2008 recession came out of nowhere for many companies. I think we had a bank failure this week.
Yes.
So another one coming out seemingly out of nowhere, although if we have them often enough, they become predictable. The 2008 recession came out of nowhere for most companies. The decrease in business because of the crash was not something that leaders could experiment their way out of. They had to create a new reality to survive, realizing that a barrier is not a bottleneck, can be a good start. These barriers can be stressful and soul-sucking, but they happen, and they may happen to you. They are a reality of leadership. Learn to know when you've hit one. It may feel like the right time to reach for a martini, to try to put it all behind you, but after years of coaching leaders, I'm a huge advocate of self-care when you hit a wall. You are the most important renewable resource. So, yeah, I think, and this again, you know, as we run our companies, you know, this idea of leaders being valuable and needing to be cared for, I think is so important, that self-care piece.
Yes. And then you did precede it with martini.
Well, I think a martini can be occasionally medicinal, but I do see sometimes when things go bad, I always worry about the leaders that try to party their way out of it.
Yeah.
Because I think it leads to more burnout.
Yeah.
And we've dealt with so many unpredictable things. I think we're in a time now that people have had to experiment and experiment and to experiment. And I think even if we go back to your illumination of the idea of the management attention, I think people are having a hard time mustering up management attention one more time for another crisis or another problem to solve. It's an interesting time that we're in right now.
For sure. You read about the 2008 crash, you know, and I'm thinking about, you know, it's 2023 as you and I talk here, but when 2020, when COVID hit, the classes our team was teaching, there was even a policy for the certifying body that we belonged to, that they had to be in person. And so I remember that Friday, the announcement came out that said, okay, figure out how to flip them all virtual. Oh, yeah, just like that, right? You know, and so we felt like we didn't have a choice. You know, we rallied together as a team and said, okay, there's a class next week that was supposed to be in person, but let's get together and run some experiments on how to still pull this off, leveraging virtual tools. And some of my competitors were like, you know what? I'm going to wait it out. I'm going to cancel a few classes. And right. I'm so glad you laughed, because I was like, there is no waiting. Like, once the genie is out of this bottle, this is going to be the new normal. So for me, it was like adapt or die. You know, it's like, we have got to figure out how to attack this barrier. So for me, that was definitely, you know, something that we had to overcome. Whereas, you know, thinking about a bottleneck, that might have been, well, Angela can't be in two places at once. So if, you know, Angela had been scheduled for something, you know, online, and then she also was needed for something in the business, that can't happen. That I think is, you know, in line with what you described as bottleneck versus barrier, right?
Yeah, where flow is constrained. You can't teach one more class because your teacher doesn't have any more capacity. Well, then you're going to train up another teacher. You're going to, you know, yeah, absolutely. Like, but the flow is already there. The process is already in place. It's the flow that's constricted, as opposed to a cliff where the thing you did forever, that's the barrier. Like, you can't offer, you know, you have a limitation where you have to offer in-person classes, and all in-person classes are canceled. It's a great example.
Or even the government you know, restraints at that time, you know, lockdown and all those things that were going on. And it seemed like policies were changing. I don't know about your experience, but for us, it felt like policies were changing daily, weekly, and we really needed to be on our toes to make sure that we could still survive through that.
Yeah, I fled Canada at one point. They had come out with another lockdown we had so many lockdowns, 5 lockdowns or something, but we had one that was, they had said they were going to check people's IDs. And if they were too far from home, they were going to ticket them.
Oh my goodness.
And that was, as an American living in Canada, that was just a bridge too far. It was like too much. So
A little scary.
I felt like I was going to get stuck in Canada, again. And I was stuck in Canada, but I also just like felt like it was too much constriction. So I asked my kids at 6:00 at night, I said, do you want to go to the US to swim? Because they were in online school. And one of them said yes, and one of them said no. And we decided we would go. And they said, well, when would we go? And I said, we're leaving at 6 a.m. in the morning, because I didn't want to give them time to figure out how to ticket us on our way to the border.
Yeah.
So I fled. It was like too much. I didn't want that. I did not want that barrier in my life.
Right.
And we went to New Mexico, where my father lives, and we stayed with him. And we were there 3.5 months, and they finished school and they swam and they did all sorts of interesting things. And we got to New Mexico, the restaurants were open, the gyms were open, the hot tubs were open. I mean, it was a whole different experience. There were no barriers. It was such a interesting, it was interesting because the countries were so different in their approaches.
Yeah.
And that we could just walk across a border and have a barrier disappear it was such a interesting experience for me as someone who looks at bottlenecks and barriers and experiments. It was all of those things.
I think this is giving some of the leaders that you talk to and educate run for their money too, because if you look at COVID as kind of an experiment, during lockdown as an experiment with working from home, okay, so now we've proven that we can do it, right? We can do it. It's possible. And as businesses are saying, okay, it's time to come back. Look at all the people going, no, I don't want to.
I think that's true. What are your thoughts on that? Like, you work with lots of people out there. What are your thoughts about online virtual work, not virtual work? Like, what's the truth telling part of you have to say about that? I have ideas of my own.
Yeah. At first I was like, nothing beats in person. Nothing beats that experience. And then as I've been forced to do some of these virtual trainings, and then even just live online in podcasts like this one, and, my own and YouTube channel and stuff like that, it is possible. And we've tried to hold in-person classes because we have our own event center. So for me, it's nothing, just open the door and, market a class, and people don't want to come. Everybody's gotten real comfy being at home. Mm-hmm. So then I listened to some of my female friends who are also business owners, and they're just losing their mind. Like, their ego is telling them stories that just isn't true about what their employees may or may not be up to. Mm-hmm. And so I'm like, don't you trust them? And a few of them, their reactions have surprised me, because they're like, no, I don't trust them. Why do they work for you? Well, now we're getting down to it. Now we have a whole different thing to talk about your business. So I used to be on one side of the fence going in person. And then I'm not a big fan of 100% online either. I've landed somewhere in the middle, a bit of balance or a bit of both.
Well, I think it's interesting. So I think there are people who are trustworthy working from home, in my experience. And I think there are people who aren't.
Agreed.
And that's true of people who work in the office too.
Agreed. Yeah.
There are people, I think the stats are, when they've actually watched people and surveyed, they get, people in the office get about 3 hours of work done a day by the time they wander around, and, and that might be true at home too. And I think we ask more questions about people who are working at home, but I also think there's been people that are super marginalized by the pandemic. People with children, I think, are the ones that have been hit so hard that even if they were like super trustworthy in the beginning, it's really hard to maintain it when every time your kid gets sick, they get sent home, and you're supposed to somehow be like parent while you're at work, because you can't take any more time off work, because why would you? Because you're at home, you can probably pull it off. I think there's some real gray areas still that as we come out, we have to think about. And I think we also sort of have relaxed some standards in the pandemic. It's like, oh, well, they're doing the best they can. And that might be okay. I mean, I don't know. I have lots of thoughts about it that are sometimes judgy, like, and sometimes I see the same people who, aren't quite pulling off the freedom, but that's always been true.
Yeah.
That some people can have freedom. I have a virtual assistant who is in the Philippines and who's always been virtual and has since and has always worked at home. And she is the hardest worker I've probably ever had in my business.
Yeah.
So no doubts at all. And, I don't know if that's true for everybody. I don't know if everyone is that motivated. I don't know if I didn't have a coaching call every hour, I don't know if I'd be that motivated.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it really exposes stuff that was already there. You know what I mean? Like you were saying,
Yeah.
if that person just isn't trustworthy, or they're not pulling their weight, or they were the person who wandered around and chit-chatted, even when they
Yeah.
were in the office, I think it's only exasperated. I think it's only exposed by being online.
Yeah, well, I want to learn more about your business too. Thanks. I mean, this is really fun just to kind of, gossip a little. But tell me about what you're experimenting with in your work and your life and your business right now.
Absolutely. Well, I made mention of opening an 8,000 square foot training and event center because pre-pandemic, we were getting kind of tired of holding our classes in, dodgy hotel ballrooms and paying $5 for a can of soda, or, it just was reflecting poorly on our business. So we're like, gee, how hard could it be? How hard could it be? Let's just open our own. And we were loving having our own space and licensing the space out to other businesses to offset costs. Boom, pandemic, lockdown, can't hold any events. Oh, funny thing, the rent is still due. Right. So
Yes.
we very quickly turned a couple of these little rooms into these studios so that we could have not only our classes be online, but have it be a higher quality experience for
Mhm.
our students and really figure out how to make that work. And then as the lockdowns lifted, a really interesting thing happened where a number of businesses had given up their own offices, right? Let their own bricks and
Oh,
mortar space go,
uh-huh.
just because they said, you know what, virtual forever,
Virtual's
right?
fun. Yeah.
Let's save some money on our own costs. Ooh, but when we do need to get together, or we do have to have some kind of training and development that still goes on, where can we hold that? So we've experienced a little bit of a boom on our little event center coming back for other people's use. The irony, right? We opened it largely for our own, but the irony is that other people are using it more so. So we have lots of little experiments running there about the different types of businesses that are
Huh.
coming back to use it. And then also people who maybe are a little burned out working from home and they just want a day away from the kids and the pets and things like that. We're not like a co-working space, which locks you into memberships and sometimes puts you at a table out in the middle, right next to your
Yeah.
peers, whether you want to be or not. We
Yeah.
have little rooms with doors, little huddle rooms with doors. And we, much like a co-working space, put out the snacks and the coffee and all that's included, but everybody gets their own door. So if they do have a high stakes presentation or they do just want some time away, they can come and use a room for an hour. They can use it for a day. So we're running a lot of experiments there to see who our new client in this post kind of COVID-ish era is going to be.
Hmm. I think that's all really interesting. And I'm curious, just because I'm always curious, as somebody who is good at Scrum, how do you think of running your space? Like, how do you think of flow in your space?
Yeah, definitely. And for those of your listeners who are like, Scrum, what is that on the bottom of my shoe? No, it's, rugby huddle, right? It comes out of all the Toyota stuff that I know you talk about in your book as well. The creators of Scrum just, took that rugby analogy further and put a little framework around it. So we very much are like a Scrum team. So we're a cross-functional team and we don't look at work as, oh, not it. I don't do that. Here's the work. It needs to happen. Who is available. And so at the beginning of every week, we do hold a little planning conversation with each other and we look at what's on the calendar. in a services business, it is a little different because, my whole team isn't here in this interview on your podcast. It's just me. So
Yeah.
Angela's marked out of capacity because everybody can see on the board and on the calendar. She's recording with Melanie today. But Angela also made coffee in the training center this morning. Angela also made sure that, she was at the front desk because there was a site visit today that one of her team members is tackling. So we have all the work on the board, and then it's very much a self-organizing, self-managing way of working.
That's really cool. I'm glad I asked that question. It's a fun way to think of it. And I love that idea that the work needs to be done. I get really frustrated when I hear like, oh, not my problem, not my job, not my job description. That might be true, but I always think of when I do a little bit of hiring consulting and think about hiring, and I talk about hiring a lot with my clients, and I always think that the most valuable person to hire is somebody who sees the world that way and thinks of the world that way and will roll up their sleeves and work as a team no matter what's on your board, what the work is that needs to be done.
We try really hard to practice some of these, values and principles that we teach. So when we hire, we're very clear that the title is team member. The title is team member. And I literally don't care what somebody puts on their LinkedIn profile or calls themselves, when it's time to move on or when they're in job search mode. It's literally making sure that no ego. And so
I love that.
We try to tell people, it's like when we use the analogy of everybody here washes dishes, no, we mean that literally. There are two dishwashers. And because we try to be green in our space, we don't do plasticware and stuff like that.
Right. So there's actually a lot of dishes.
There's actually dishes and flatware. And it's like, you're going to be the one. There's two dishwashers, but somebody's got to load it and unload it. And if your ego is telling you don't do that, this may not be the home for you. This may not be the team for you.
Who else shouldn't be on your team? What else do you look for when you hire?
So we also look for somebody who not only has that ego, and tells themselves that they only do one thing. We also have had a challenge in the past where somebody thinks, that they're all that in a bag of chips, because humility is really important to us. And so we talk about making failures daily, but fail just stands for first attempt in learning. And so when people have come across as kind of preachy or condescending, that doesn't go well with clients. Usually when people want to learn this new way of working, they want to hear about what didn't work, and they want to hear about the struggles, and they want to hear about what we learned from our own experiments and failures and how we leveraged that. So we really look for an element of humility in people when we hire.
I love it. It's such an interesting conversation. What should people know about, like, when should they seek you out? What do you have to offer the world that they might be interested in?
We are really good at teaching people different ways of working. So yes, we do know Scrum, and yes, we do know Kanban and all those happy things. And if people want to get certified in it, we certainly can offer those things. But sometimes people just want to bring a little more clarity to their own workforce and figure out how to get things moving, whether that's making work more visible, whether that's ordering a list so that there's no question what's first, what's second. How do they work better together as a team? Those are the kinds of things that we excel at helping individuals and companies do.
It's so interesting because I've worked in with different tech leaders for a long time. So I'm sort of watched the agile processes or Scrum processes. And then I did Seth Godin's Alt MBA program, and he talks all about shipping work. So that, which I also love because, until it is complete, essentially means completing, it doesn't exist until it's complete. So you invest a lot, and then it doesn't, if you don't finish it, nothing happens. And I found his process is really interesting. And I think that whole idea of making work visible, of understanding the flow of work, or, if you're talking about gold rat or something like that, you're talking about throughput, throughput in factories. It's such an interesting, I love thinking about how work works, like how we improve flow, how we think about the relationships to people when they're making work, all of those things. So I find it quite fascinating.
Love Seth Godin. That's one of the people I love reading as well. That's awesome.
Yeah, he is one of the most productive people. Wow, is he productive? Where can people find you, Angela?
They can find me at our website, which is collaborativeleadershipteam.com. And I know it's a mouthful. Who names their company Collaborative Leadership Team, right? So even if you type in coleadteam.com, we pop right up. And being wonderfully generic is Angela Johnson. If you look for Angela Johnson on LinkedIn, probably about 30,000 people come up. But if you put in Angela Johnson Scrum, I bubble right up to the top.
Oh, perfect. That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for being on my show. It's been such a pleasure to get to chat with you. It's been just a joy.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks again for having me.
If you'd like to learn more about how focusing on bottlenecks can transform your own leadership, check out my book, The Experimental Leader. You can get a copy at book.experimentalleader.com. I think you can magically transform your leadership by spending more time focusing on your bottlenecks and less time focusing on your challenges. It's been so fun to be here with you today. And I love talking with Angela Johnson. It was fun to look at processes that we share, things that come from Toyota, things that come from Scrum, things that come from Goldratt, and to dive into the things that we think about when we're trying to create teams. I love the humility aspect that Angela hires for. I think it's a good trait, and the idea of calling everyone a team member. Those are things that will stick with me for a long time. I challenge you to think about the things that you want on your teams and what do you want to hire for, and go experiment.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Experimental Leader. We hope you have found value in today's episode because we're dedicated to helping you become the experimental leader you want to be. To access the show notes or learn more about working with Melanie, visit melanieparish.com. Go experiment.